Hi, folks. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes. So sit back, relax, and we'll be right back to you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started today. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Ibrahim, and I am Program Manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio at the Mass Cultural Council. The CIP's focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, and we are excited to present the first part of a two-part series this week and next week on operating in a changing world. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. This spring, we are offering 2 free workshops every week in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, and board governance. Joining us today is Christine Alvarez from the Nonprofit Finance Fund. I'll turn it over to her in just a second, but just a few ground rules before we get going. Feel free to rename yourself or say hi in the chat with your organization. Just kind of give a wave that you're here. This session has automatic captioning, as you could probably already know by now. Auto-generated captions are provided on all Mass Cultural Council Zoom meetings and webinars. If you do need any additional accommodations to ensure your participation for the future, you can just let us know when you register. If this is distracting for you, you can always minimize that by clicking hide subtitles in the closed captioning settings. We will have time for questions and answers throughout today's session. So we invite you to use the Q&A function of Zoom, not the chat, just the Q&A, and Christine's going to answer questions as we go along. So when you've got a burning question, feel free to put it out and we'll be happy to get that answered for you. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council YouTube channel probably tomorrow. We'll email you that when that is ready. My colleague Kaylin King is here, and she's going to be providing some resources in the chat box as we go along. And this session is an hour, 60 minutes, and that includes time for questions and answers. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Christine.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thanks to everyone at MCC for having us back. It's wonderful to see you again. Good afternoon, everyone. Just really appreciate you carving out time today. And I love the opportunity to spend the next hour with you. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we're entering, all of us, I think, are entering into this space from very different parts of our day. And so whether you're coming straight from another Zoom meeting, straight away, or just taking 2 steps like I did just now from supporting school-age kids and virtual like schooling or just other real life activities. Just want to take a moment to ground us and move us, as best as possible, and have some separation, into this learning space. And so just in a moment, I'm going to invite you to take 3 focused breaths with me. I'll keep a circular visual on screen just to keep it fun and to help guide us in taking a deep breath in as the circle expands and breathe out as the circle gets smaller. And we'll do this just 3 times together, just briefly. I'm going to actually turn off my webcam for just a moment because I apparently make a very funny face when I do this. So yeah, we're going to do 3 together. Breathe in and out. Again. Last one. Great. Well, and so thank you so much for taking that pause with me. I'm not sure if I needed it more than everyone else on the line, but just we're meeting virtually, and before we actually get into the meat of our discussion today. And each of us, we want to, even though we're in this virtual space, just want to acknowledge that we're all individually joining from a specific land, and just the importance of acknowledging the history that's attached to that land and its people. Today in particular, the session is about finance, but we'll be focusing on the larger systems that our organizations live and exist inside of, and all of the financial realities and hardships that come with that. And so those systems all exist within a broader context of our nation's history. And so just by acknowledging that history, we hope to just begin to widen the lens beyond the current moment, and just specifically situate today's conversation as part of a much larger movement towards equity that we as individuals and organizations are all a part of. And so today I'm joining from unceded lands stolen from the Lenni Lenape people. And today that land is known as Philadelphia. And if you don't know the territory that you reside on or that you're dialing in on, I would invite you to click on the link that we're sharing on screen, and you can certainly look that up if you're comfortable. I also invite you to share in the chat the Indigenous territory that you're dialing in from. Just give folks just a moment. Fantastic. Great, thank you for sharing. I think there may be some folks, I recognize a couple of folks in the participant list. So some of you may be familiar with NFF, but just very briefly, our mission is to help community-centered organizations gain better control over the financial resources as well as knowledge that they need to reach their aspirations for the communities that they serve. We do this in a few different ways. We provide loans to nonprofit organizations. We also advise and consult organizations and funders on how to better use and better deploy funds in the sector. And outside of capital and consulting, we're also in the very beginning stages of building a movement that shifts funding and financing practices so that money can flow more easily, and with less restriction to community organizations. So we work with partners on the ground to lift up those learnings so that we can share, what it is that we're learning, in terms of here, something that we've noticed, in the sector that's not working. Here's what we think that could help make it work better for organizations and the people that they serve. We're a 40-year organization with offices across the country. And I think currently we're about 90 people strong. So just a little bit of a sense, of who we are. And personally, I just like to introduce myself and the team that you'll be hearing from over the course of the next several weeks. We really organized the first half of this 12-part webinar series to be led by this team of me, Michael Cass, whom some of you may have met last week, and you'll be also meeting our colleagues, Robert Kagan and Marisa Kubasek, in our later sessions. But this first half of the series is really about the core building blocks of financial management, particularly within the context of this new world, with change and uncertainty that we're all navigating. And so if you joined last week, you had a chance to hear from Michael, about financial leadership with boards. And that brings us, to today's session about the broader system of the nonprofit sector. If it's helpful, just wanted to introduce myself, obviously that you kind of know what my lens is to this work. I've been with the organization since 2005, and I currently coach and support organizational leaders across the country with a focus on strengthening their financial capacity. And so while that's the focus, I really bring the lens of programs from my previous working experiences in the sector. One in particular, that stands out to me, where I started my work in the sector with a small AmeriCorps program that supported after-school programs in Philadelphia. And it was really that work that I think I had a pretty, a deep crash course, into really understanding what it meant, to wear a lot of different hats and just the reality that a lot of nonprofit organizations and leaders are having to manage simultaneously while attempting to build financial resiliency. And so that's kind of like the lens, that I bring into this work. It'd be wonderful to get a sense, of who is in the room. And so in just a moment, I'm going to ask Kaylin or Michael, if you could just help with the first poll, just so that we could get a sense of who is sitting, in this virtual room. Just going to give that just a moment. Yeah, thank you, Kaylin. Also, just reminding folks, if you haven't introduced yourself, please go ahead and do so. All right. Let's see. I believe that the poll results, if you can't see them, I'm actually just going to go through. Yeah, so we have a pretty great, mix of folks on the phone today. Just about a third that are in an executive role. 25% that's from some representation from the board, as well as a program, finance folks, operations, and other. So yeah, that I appreciate the other. And if you could just, if there's something specific you want us to know as we're moving through this material, about your role, please let us know if you were in that other category. So yeah, well, this is great. I think we're gonna have a great kind of like range of experience here. So with that, great. Let me just move. Okay, great. And so, as I said, like this first half of the series is going to be about laying down the core building blocks for managing finances in this new world. And so today is really about just the broader system and the broader context of how all of us are operating, navigating. Beginning next week, we're going to dig more deeply into some of the tools and the processes that I'm going to introduce today. So this is part of a two-part kind of like module, around operating in this kind of like new change environment. So today we're going to preview a little bit, about not just the system, but then what are some of the tools and steps in terms of getting clear on where your organization stands financially, and then how to take a deeper dive into tactical budgeting, looking at your access to cash and managing cash flow, not just in the short term, but more medium and long term. And then how do we start to think about building flexibility into our plans for the future, while also staying true and not shying away from articulating what it truly costs, for us to carry out our plans. So just know that, that's going to be sort of like the arc, of this session and next. Today's going to be, more, focused on kind of like context, beginning to preview, some of the financial tools and steps, and then Michael, will help continue in digging deeper, into some of the more detailed, like parts of revenue discounting and budgeting and so on. So thank you, for raising your hands like in that poll. And so I know it seems, quite obvious, just to say that it is hard, to manage, not just in this environment, but just to lead organizations in the nonprofit sector, even in the best of times. And so even before diving into the financial planning concepts, we really just wanted to take a second to really locate like where financial planning processes are situated. And so it is about understanding the overall context and the structural dynamics, and just the real life implications of what it means, for us to function and operate within this system that was designed, with this specific, unevenness. But we also wanted that, to be our jumping off point for lifting up strategies for not just coping in this environment, but also thriving. And so our goals for today specifically are about just building a shared awareness about the structurally inequitable system in which we operate. It was designed, specifically, to operate in this way. And so learning how to build skills to navigate the system, is one of the is our second goal, in this discussion. And as I said, we will preview or begin to unpack some of the core concepts of nonprofit finance and tools. And particularly, within the context of like, what is it that I should be doing as a leader in this moment, or what would be helpful, for me and my leadership and board team, to begin thinking about. And so just a moment on, kind of like how we view this space is that, NFF, as I said, we've been around, for a while, so we certainly have like a point of view, and experiences to share from the field. And so we're certainly looking forward to doing that. But I also, recognize that this is a peer learning environment, with a lot of, experts in the virtual room. And so to the extent that you feel comfortable, and able to share in the Q&A, or the chat, we would just ask you to contribute, to making a meaningful learning experience, even despite kind of like the limitations of a virtual room. And we do honor the experiences of each person who's here and hope that we can learn from each other, and just ask that you share freely and candidly. On that last note, do take care of yourselves first. I understand, a year into the pandemic, I also anticipate that folks are also zoomed out. And so appreciate, that, you may need to take care of yourselves. So please do that. And I'm going to just briefly touch on this visual. For some, it will be new. Michael, my colleague, referenced this last week in his board session. When we talk about nonprofit finance, and just like we do try to think about the interconnectedness that that financial considerations have with mission, values, and vision. And I know it seems like something that's really obvious, but I think so much in the work that that I see and that my team sees in our work with organizations is that finances just tend to get siloed, especially in a time when leaders feel pressure to make what is the right decision, in an environment that is just constantly moving and still has a lot of unknowns. And so this is just a mindful prompt here. It just as a reminder, for us to remember to bring things back into alignment. And if we look at an organization's budget, it does become clear just like what is the priority like in that moment. And so yes, it's about accounting, and getting, like kind of like the pieces lined up, but it is more, for us, a greater priority in how we integrate financial questions and considerations into the broader decision making, about the organization and its mission. And so, yeah, just wanted to bring this one back up, as we started to think about context. Let me just make sure. Oh yes, and then I when I was thinking about this session, I admittedly, was thinking about just a lot of the hardship, and the themes, that talk about certainly the inequities and the difficulties of operating in the sector, particularly now. And just thought it was really important to start off, just by acknowledging the strengths of the sector too. It's something that I think that is, starting from kind of like a strengths or, asset based, point of view is, certainly something that I never take for granted, especially, when we're talking about money and mission. And I came across, in thinking about this particular session, I came across a lot of stories about resilience and strengths in the sector, particularly in the arts and culture community. This one is just one, of many that I came across. It happens to be in an article that I saw from Indiana, and it just struck me there were a lot of beautiful kind of just like photographs that were provided, on Arts United, and the one quote that I put here, I just it sort of just took my breath away, just to think about just like at a time when human connection and dialogue, unity, has become just so important, that it has really been the arts and culture community that has been among others, that has stepped forward. And there was another, kind of like piece of an article, within this context that talked about, even though the restrictions caused by COVID-19 really providing a lot of hindrances and barriers to programs, that arts and culture nonprofits were actually stepping in or leaning in to reimagine how they could continue to serve their mission and just adjust their activities and their operations. So even though the challenges have been going on for a year, it's hard to to say that it's been a whole year, that nonprofits in this community are very honestly sharing their experiences, of becoming adaptive and resilient. So I just thought it was a great opportunity, just to spotlight this particular article, because I do think that the question that we often get in our work is, if the system is so hard to navigate in the nonprofit sector, and it's even more difficult now because of COVID, or the impact of COVID, what is one of the first things that organizational leaders can be doing right now? And so I just wanted to, this is actually the framework that we would start with in good times and in hard times, that we really start from a place of assessing where are our strengths, so that we can understand what are the next practical steps and what are our options. And so in just a moment, I'm going to ask this group to begin to practice and engage in some of the questions within these categories. But it is important to understand the full set of strengths and the resources that we all bring. There are a lot of different forms that you can take inventory or take stock of where your organization is. But it is, just whatever that format is, it is an important one. And so today I'm bringing up, something that we use often, which is a strengths framework. And we do look at the different types of assets that an organization brings, even though they may not be the things that show up in a financial report. And so what I mean by that is, we have financial resources down at the bottom, and you would kind of look to the income statement and balance sheet to get an idea of well, what does the organization own that has sort of like a monetary value. But there's so many other pieces around an organization's strengths that don't show up, and so they include things like the social, strengths, relationships, and reputation, certainly people and skills, and then the data and know-how for delivering on mission. And so when we use this framework, this is typically how we enter into a lot of our conversations with organizational leaders, because it is true that not all the assets that go into supporting or advancing an organization's missions, they're not just the financial ones. And also just to acknowledge that this is a place where it helps us at least more clearly see, like where inequities play out, when we do this kind of assessment. A lot of times, just for an example, I'll see, like organizations as they're doing this, clients who don't have, really big budgets or large balance sheets. And so on paper, they may not look like they have a lot of financial strength, or they may not have boards, that have access to wealth or deep pockets, or connections to big funders. And so when we apply this lens, we then start to look at how volunteers, for example, may contribute thousands of hours of skilled expertise, and how their relationships in the community bring resources, and they may open doors. And so their ability to learn and iterate, for some groups, is really what makes them nimble and effective. And so, so I just offer those examples, because I think that it is a piece, that gets lost, in a lot of the financial planning conversations, and every organization is different. So I just wanted to invite all of you, as you think about your own organization, just going to pause for just a moment. This is, part of a much deeper, exercise. But if you could just take, 15, 20 seconds, to share examples of how the strengths, that you're the most proud of, like how do they show up for your organization? Yeah, community engagement, sort of like the ability, to really foster and build trust within community. Thank you. Okay, good. I also see donors who've maintained their commitment. Next year is concerning, for sure, as you know, as well as the dedication of staff. Great. This is great. Okay, good. Well, and continue to to share, as you feel comfortable. And I appreciate those examples of community engagement and trust. Like particularly within the context of those who are closest, to community and really understanding what it takes, to meet the aspirations, of that community. That's yeah, I think particularly in this current environment, is critical. Okay, so I'm going to actually roll us through, and thank you for just helping us start. And this was actually my animated prompt, of that question. And I would encourage you, at a later point. And I was talking a little bit about, values, just to close up, like this early section. Do also reflect on, because the year has gone, very quickly and slow, at the same time, where time has moved in very strange ways. But yeah, as we think about strengths, I would, also ask you, to reflect, from this session, just how a financial decision has reflected your core values. And so I'm going to roll us forward, but, just would encourage you to continue, to hold those. Kaylin also provided a worksheet that provides some space, for you to continue to reflect, on these areas. Have found it helpful, particularly in conversations with board and program team members, just to kind of get an assessment, from different sides of the team. Okay. So after starting from a place of strength, much of the core principles of what we do at NFF is about, how do we build the financial part of that strengths framework. So much of our expertise, really lives inside that domain. And so we use this, kind of like, model, as far as like how to think about financial strengths from a very fundamental but important way. And so I kind of don't even want to dig into this, at this moment, because we have to understand what, not just like the how, but have to understand the what, of the system in terms of like what we're navigating, and then the tools, that will help us manage. So I'm going to go right past this. And we're going to talk a little bit about just some of the dynamics, that all of us are just managing, even if we haven't put terms, to some of these dynamics. This work is really hard to do, as I said, right at the beginning of the hour. And so understanding and unpacking the structural pieces, some of this is going to feel like not rocket science, but, again, the goal is to just find just shared language, for how we talk about the challenges. And so when we talk about systemic challenges, we do need to start, by first acknowledging that our sector is plagued with racial inequity. Community-based organizations, especially those led by and serving people of color, and larger, institutions, they're just not operating on the same level playing field. The system leaves out many, and the efforts of just philanthropists and financial intermediaries, including NFF. Right now is an important moment where we're needing to take stock, of how our own, practices have inadvertently perpetuated inequity. But the data, like it just, there's so many data points, to speak to, but just the two that I'll raise, for today, is just some recent research that just showcase just like how current funding is particularly failing communities serving families and communities of color. So just two examples, and here we see on the left hand side that There was $24 billion in grants deployed in the United States in 2016, but only 10% went towards funding communities of color. 90% went towards funding for white communities. On the right side, oh, let me go back. And on the right side, this is a data point that comes from Echoing Green, and we can see just the really significant differences between organizations, in the Echoing Green Fellowship that focuses on improving life outcomes for Black men and boys in the United States, and just the contrast between Black-led organizations and other organizations, that revenues were 45% less, and unrestricted net assets were also 91% less. So these data points, live within a larger body of data, but just tells us, that the communities of color not only, are granted, fewer dollars, but they also just have less control, over how that money is used. And so why am I starting this discussion here? This could easily be an entire day of content, but it's important to start here because the rules of finance that we're about, to step into, they include funding practices that are exacerbated or exacerbating these inequities. And so just want to hold that in our minds as we move into not just like who controls money flows, but who benefits. And so it's going to seem like a strange, like unrelated question. But I will just say, I would ask you to think about what is your kind of like beverage of choice in the morning? I personally am a coffee person. I know that there's tea drinkers, perhaps, and others. So I'm just going to ask you to take a second. If you wouldn't mind sharing, like, what is your beverage of choice in the morning? This will all make a little bit more sense in just a moment. But, thought it was helpful, just to use that example just to help ground us, into this next session. So I'm going to participate. I am coffee. All right. So lots of coffee. I love water. Chai tea. It's been forever since I've actually had chai tea. Yeah, but perfect. Water and coffee, veggie juice. All right, awesome. Well, as I see, this is a crowd that likes, or the majority, certainly appreciates caffeine. So I'm just going to ask you to hold on to that example because the money rules, they do look different for nonprofits as compared to other sectors. And so for that coffee or tea shop, or chai tea, company, that transaction, it tends to, and I'm just going to click through these. But that tends to, oopsie daisy, let me go back for just a sec. There we go. That it tends to just involve a single payer. If I'm the buyer, of that cup of coffee, and, in the scenario where I walk into a shop, there's, essentially three things, that's going on, that whether we're explicit or implicit about it. And that is, that the transaction, it typically involves a single payer system. Like I'm the end user, I'm also the person who's consuming and purchasing or making the purchase. And there are a lot of things that go into like how I assess that decision to purchase. It might be price point, it might be convenience, it could be quality, but I'm really assessing that, as someone who's going to ultimately be the consumer or user of that product and service. There's also a distinction, between me, someone who's going to buy a cup of coffee versus an individual who wants to build the company and may make a larger investment to help build the actual company or organization. There's a single bottom line that's often involved, and where the goal is primarily profit. So overhead and profit, that's just viewed as a thing. It's just something that's accepted as necessary. The price point, like I'm willing to pay $3 for a cup of coffee because it's worth it, for me. It's in my budget and I valued it in such a way that I will make that purchase. And so I don't even think about, just sort of like, what part of that $3 is covering the cost, or the overhead or direct, like that. It is a single transaction, for me. And for the company, it is really about generating revenue or surplus. Trust and management I have in here just because I wouldn't walk into the coffee shop and ask them to direct $2.50 towards just the coffee beans or the staff compensation of the barista. Those just aren't, like parts, of how a typical transaction, in the for-profit world would happen. And so when we turn to, oh, and I'm sorry, I do have an example here of just, we had the ability to break down, sort of like what lives inside of that cost, that $3 example I was just talking about. And so, while it may not be necessarily surprising, there are a lot of things that live inside of that $3 that have nothing to do with the direct costs. There's a little bit, here and there for the actual coffee beans, and the steamed milk, and some portion of rent, labor, and utilities. But $2.23 is acceptable, for me as the buyer. And I'm not really asking questions, about, where that 74% is going. So that's just a very, sort of like fast example, as most transactions happen in the for-profit world. And so I guess I just wanted to ask, via a poll here, when you kind of like take that hat off of sort of like the coffee or tea or I think someone said veggie juice, if I'm not mistaken, as if you take your hat off as the consumer or even the company of that product, and then, think about some of those same fundamental principles as they apply to the nonprofit world, I would just ask, how do you generally feel about these dynamics? And if it's not, okay. And I do see that the poll is administered. So yeah, if you could just give a shot at just like gut check. That came in pretty fast as generally, I think most of the early, responses, are leaning one way. Just give folks just 10 more seconds. Okay. All right. Okay, so we do see just an overwhelming number of folks, and I recognize that not everyone responded to the poll, but I think there's some really good reasons for why there is a majority this feeling. Just my gut reaction is that this is just really not the way that the world works for nonprofit groups. Let me just close this. And so just to walk it through, in our world, a lot of us, there are some exceptions to this, for sure, but our clients or the people that we serve, in many cases, they are not the sole buyer, or that there are third party payers that are involved, and they're part, of that assessment of the value and just what the how do we think about like setting the price point or or what should it actually cost. And so that direct relationship is really different for us, even in the case where we have fees for either ticket, like folks who are purchasing tickets to attend a performance, or a show, or even, like tuition dollars. In many cases, there is a mission purpose that is not, being that's not being met, by some, market. Yeah, and I see that Margaret has written in just that most of the $25 million of small businesses are lucky to have 5 to 10% profit, and that is true. In that small businesses they do struggle with just having to turn over a profit, and the premise is still true that their end game is that they are generating some sort of surplus with the provision of services. on the nonprofit side, many of us are having to manage, to both the bottom line financially as well as impact. And overhead, and frankly, profits tends to have some negative connotation, in terms of, well, nonprofits shouldn't be generating a surplus, and which is just incorrect. And price, is often not set at a place where it will cover the full cost of doing business. And so there is, kind of like an aspect that there is a money losing proposition, or activity that we're meeting a need with a low commercial return, which we'll get back to in just a minute. And that, I have, sort of like this phrase here, distrust around the kind of like money, because restrictions, that is, a very specific way, that donors are ensuring that their contributions are being used with fidelity, or, in a sound way. And so restrictions, they do tend to complicate, what we have to track and manage, whether it's kind of like time or purpose restrictions. So the accounting, becomes really messy, relative to the for-profit side of things. And so I'm just going to take a moment here, and you don't have to chat anything in here, but just, want to give folks a moment to reflect on, specifically for your organization, how do these dynamics show up for you and for the field? The corresponding question I'll ask is, what are the things that you're already doing, to navigate these challenges? And if there are things that are working well, that's fantastic, and we would love to hear about those, strategies. So just going to give folks just about 10 more seconds just to begin to contemplate. And I'm going to roll us forward, because it has been important to talk about just what the factors and the dynamics have looked like. We want to shift, into, well, so what are some of like the so what's, to this? And so just as a recap, the overarching impact, for our sector is that the combination, of like the various kind of like money roles, it does lead, to a place, where nonprofits, we're constantly having to, demonstrate, the importance of surpluses. Nonprofits, the nomenclature is unfortunate, that nonprofit, it is a tax status, not a business model. And so depending on who you're speaking with, there is some, some sort of like baseline, like education and awareness that is often needed, just so that there is agreement, that nonprofits, should, be striving for and building in surpluses into their budget. Another, myth, that is often perpetuated is just the use of the overhead ratio as a measure of our value, when really it is about the impact, and outcomes of our communities. And then lastly, I mentioned this before, just, that nonprofits can be or should be self-sufficient, and just putting on kind of like an older hat from previous works experience. I thought that is one of the things that I would be frustrated by, was it's just like kind of the notion that nonprofits ought to be or function more like businesses, and if they could do that, they would be able to be more quote unquote self-sufficient, and the need for grantors or donations would go away, when the truth is that we're always going to need third party payers. And so just wanted to name like just how all of the various money flows, like who controls the money, how it flows into the sector, and how the roles are different between nonprofit and for-profits. That's what we're feeling on this side of the sector, in terms of like what we then have to manage, in terms of having to make the case for surplus, moving away from the overhead ratio as the primary measure of worth, and having to demonstrate that we are our business model requires multiple sources of funds. And so one of the tools, and I'll just touch on a couple of pieces here, is that at the end of the day, we are running multiple businesses, and that is the mission business and the subsidy business. When we compare for-profit entities, and if this is the cost of doing business up here in this purple, most for-profits are recovering that cost from direct fees from customers, where nonprofits, they do have this gap that they often fill from what we're calling subsidy revenues, whether that's grants or contributions from individuals, earned income ventures. And the key here is that, like, each of these individual subsidy businesses, they require their own set of capacities and expertise to run. And that when a program grows or changes, that the need for subsidy, it never actually goes away. So growth is not an option. If you're trying to make it such that an organization never has to fundraise again, in actuality that need for subsidy, it actually expands as an organization gets larger. When an organization isn't able to meet that cost of services with direct fees and subsidy revenues, they will often engage in cost reduction strategies that leads to that's in the form of either volunteers or unpaid labor. Sweat equity is the term that we wanted to put here very explicitly, just to name that there are many in our sector that are putting in hours and time that is not necessarily being compensated. And so the point, is just that, to balance money and mission, nonprofits are constantly managing a complex portfolio of activities. And as a result of having to run those two businesses, we often end up seeing that nonprofits, have to manage, this portfolio. And this is probably, a familiar grid, but just to orient you, we just have the this 2x2 along the horizontal axis, we have mission impact, and along the vertical, we have financial contribution. And ideally, many folks want to be up here or have a lot of their programs in this upper right-hand quadrant, where all of their work is highly mission aligned, and that all of it is also making a lot of money. But what we know in the sector is that we are filling a market gap, and there's no obvious financial return for the work that we're doing. So in part, like a lot of the most of the mission aligned work that we provide, it does wind up falling in this bottom right hand quadrant, where activities are super mission aligned, but they either have like a low or negative dollar contribution. And all that just to say that there's no right mix, of what your activities should look like on this grid. The key is that we are really clear and intentional about what it's going to take, to maintain high impact activities, and ensure that there is a balance, between each of these dimensions. There's more to say here, which my colleague Alice Antonelli later in the series will talk, specifically about, how do we really assess this, in greater detail, so that we can, look at mission and money impact. And so I mentioned, as we're talking about the structural dynamics, the question then becomes, well, so how does one, really manage through this? And so, for us, a lot of like the basic principles of financial strength, they do, I mean, they maintain, and they do, have a lot to do with like just how we think about like our current business model. And so this is going to just be a little bit of an introduction, to what Michael will pick up in the next session. But when we think about a healthy business model, we're thinking about, typically what you would see on your budget, or your income statement, in terms of, are you generating the revenue that is needed to cover your costs, over the course of the year. And it sounds, kind of Pollyannish, to say, well, of course, you would just need to generate consistent surpluses. But it is, sort of like the cycle that is needed, for capital structure or any sort of like strength on the balance sheet. That that relies or depends entirely on whether or not, we do have some sort of surplus that's remaining at the end of each year. And that if there is strength here in our balance sheet, that then we have the ability to reinvest, back into the things that we need, to carry out programs, or into the business model. And so that's just a little bit of a preview, of what Michael will pick up in our next session. And as we dig into sort of some of the financial statements, like assessment next week, a lot of the questions that we're fielding right now have to do with, well, what are some of the things that I ought to be thinking about now, as the world is changing around me. And so we go to kind of like these three pieces that actually follow the arc of many of the sessions that our team will be providing over the course of the next several weeks. And so next week, Mike will pick up on the thread of just understanding, well, where do you stand financially today, and how can you determine, like, what are your priorities and the trade-offs as you're making decisions in your future plan for next year or beyond. The second piece is really about thinking about your budget and identifying the places that you have the best chance of building in flexibility. And a lot of that has to do with like making it really transparent and enhancing the visibility of where there may be risks or hardships, as well as opportunities. And so in some of the subsequent sessions, we will be digging much deeper into not just like basic budgeting, but how do I start to unpack my budget, and what are some of the tactics that I can employ so that I can have or build in some flex. And then the last piece, is really kind of like tying everything together. Particularly right now, telling your financial story without apology and with ownership, of the numbers. I think that we're just seeing, over and over again is becoming, increasingly important in terms of how do we bring along staff, board, funders, and the broader community, so that we can help support the organization. And so I'm going to just pause here. I'm just going to check to make sure that I'm not losing any questions. And so, okay. Okay, and so I'm just going to take a few minutes just to lift up two specific tactics that will be helpful just to think on, as whether you attend a future financial planning session with NFF in the coming weeks or not. Just to my point about, thinking about budgeting strategies and, trying to draw out as much visibility and building in flex, as much as you can. There are some additional slides, that are at the end of the deck, but all of this, really resides in the budget. And so the first step, is really about increasing, as I was describing it as visibility. You start with the current budget, you look at the assumptions, and really interrogate, like, what are the things and the risks that may change, as well as the things that we don't have control over. So I think, kind of like laying these things out and actually putting them down on paper, with board members and with team, this becomes, a helpful starting point, for how we enter in to this year's budget and how we think about managing. There are some questions, that we also put in the worksheet that will be, a great, place to engage or, just continue to think on. These get into much more greater details about the dynamics and specific categories of revenue and expense. And for those of you who will be following on, with us, we will be getting into greater detail. And for those of you who will just who may only attend, this session. These questions, provide a good place, as you enter into not just the budget planning process for next year, but again, that piece about bringing on board and staff along the way. I've been getting a question, that I wanted to just to mention here that has to do with, when there is so much that we've already cut and trim on the expenses, and if, thinking about just kind of like budget practices, like are there things, that we can just be thinking about within our current budget that can help, like on that visibility front. And so one piece, is that we would really recommend, after you've started with the expenses, that just as you think about managing uncertainty, one of the ways to navigate around the uncertainty of revenue is to actually discount or apply probabilities of revenue, because things like relationships with funders and funder strategy, the economy, all of those things are moving targets. And so we're having a lot of conversations with clients now, that in the absence of really understanding, like, well, there is really no other place for us to cut. How do we start to forecast revenue? One way, is to think about discounting, revenue sources that are in your budget, and then applying, based on how secure or reliable those sources are. Just apply a probability method, so that you have a way of factoring in that part of uncertainty into your actual budget. And and so I think, on this point, I am going to just pause because I want to give Michael Ibrahim just a moment to come back, and just in just a moment. But before I do, I'm just going to pause for just one moment here and roll us, just so that you can see where we're headed. That today was really about just shared awareness and talking about the system and getting clear about like the different dynamics that we're all navigating. We began to preview some of the core concepts within financial tools, particularly around the budget. If all of us are having to manage to money and mission, that starting with the budget, is one immediate place to go. But, there will be a continuation, when Michael picks up next week, that does get into greater detail about just revenue discounting methods, or ways, of kind of like building in uncertain factors into your budget process. We'll also be talking about just like the balance sheet side of things, and how do we think about kind of like our cash position currently, and what are some best practices, for how we plan and manage. So for those of you who are eager to jump in, into more a deeper dive into the tools, we'll be back here, same time, next Tuesday at 1, to pick up and really, walk through some of the specific frameworks and tools.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you for everyone for taking an hour of your time today. If you haven't registered for our second parter, you can do that. Kaylin's been putting some links in the chat, so feel free to do that if you want to continue that conversation with Michael. Also, this Thursday, we have a webinar on how to conduct strategic planning when you may not know what's coming down the road 1 month, 2 months from now. So Sarah Glatt will be with us on that day from Paper Crane Associates. It'll be a great conversation about strategic planning. That's at 2 o'clock. So you can get all of those sessions and register for everything on our main blog page. In the meantime, thank you, Christine, for offering this wonderful primer for next week. And thank you to everybody for doing all the hard work that you do every single day for your organizations and your communities. We'll see you at the very next workshop. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.